Hey, Rabbi, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, and you?
Hashem, carrying on, thank you.
Hello, Stephen. I was getting worried. I didn't see anybody here at 1 o'clock. Maybe my watch is fast. Hello, everybody. Hello, Kent. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Rabbi. Hello,
Yeah.
everyone.
Rabbi, hello everyone.
It's time to take a break, Kent. Why are you still working?
Some people can't get retired yet, like you, Rabbi.
But I'm not wearing a tie.
True.
And I'm going to Cape Town this afternoon, please God.
Ah, well, please God, you have a good time here. Just don't bring any COVID with you.
You got it already. You don't need me. I'll mind my own business. I have no plans on coming to Claremont, so don't worry.
I'm in Constantia, yeah. But
Oh, sorry. I always get mixed up between those two places.
No
Rabbi
problem.
Green.
With a
Yeah.
C. Hello, Martin. Hello, Pia. Okay, let's get moving. I got a plane to catch just now. So I was hoping to get some of Yom Kippur, which was more interesting stuff, but now we got another one of these technical things on Me'ilah. So if you learned yesterday, chapter 1, it will give the basic introduction. Me'ilah is, you can translate it as sacrilege. What is sacrilege? It means if you use something sacred, sacred for your own personal mundane use or benefit. So we're not allowed to. It's sacred. It's reserved for holy stuff. And you now use it for your own personal use, that is sacrilege. You have violated the sanctity of the object. So if it's an animal, you learned yesterday, if there's an animal, let's say a sheep that has been sanctified, consecrated for the temple, you can't go and shear the wool of the sheep and go make a jersey. That wool is also part of the animal and is sacred, and you may not use it to make a jersey. So here we go into a lot of technical details now. So The prohibition against Me'ilah Kochim Kalim does not apply to sacrifices of the lesser degree. We've already discussed this long ago, the different kinds of sacrifices. Some are called Koche Kochim, major sanctity. Some are called Kochim Kalim, lesser sanctity. And there are different halachas pertaining to each. So if it's the offerings of lesser sanctity, you do not violate the prohibition against Me'ilah until the blood has been cast on the altar. Okay, so the animal's been consecrated, it's been shechted, but the blood has not yet been put on the altar. And until such time as it does, you're not in violation. So we'll soon see that the holier things, the koche kochim, things of greater sanctity, you become guilty if you use it even from the time it's consecrated, I think. And here you're only guilty if it's after the blood has been cast on the altar. If the blood has been cast on the altar, the prohibition against meal applies to the fats and organs of the animal until they're taken to the ash heap, or they are designated for the altar's pyre. So they're meant to burn out on the altar. And if you took it before that, you are going to be guilty and you'll be in violation of Me'ilah. If it's something that is going to be eaten, then it does not apply. And it's a different problem that, not everybody's allowed to eat every sacrificial meat. Some are for the kohanim, some are for the donors, some are for both. Even if the fats and the organs were brought to the altar before the blood was cast upon it, the prohibition against meal does not apply until the blood is cast. So if you reverse the order, it still will apply. If the fats and organs were taken outside the temple courtyard before the blood was cast, the prohibition against meal does not apply until the blood is cast. If it was cast while they were outside and they had not been brought back in, the prohibition does apply. For casting the blood has an effect on the status of a sacrifice, whether it leads to a lenient ruling or a stringent one. So once the blood has been cast, then it's serious and it's more consecrated, so to speak. 2, the prohibition against meal applies to all the sacrifices of the koche kochim, the most sacred order, the greater sanctity, from the time they were consecrated, okay? With the lesser sanctity, we said it's only after the blood has been cast on the altar. Now we say it's from the time they were consecrated until the blood is cast on the altar. Once the blood is cast, the prohibition against Me'ilah applies to the portions that are to be consumed entirely on the altar until they're burnt and taken to the ash heap. The prohibition does not apply to the portions that are to be eaten as explained before. Meaning, 3, the prohibition against Me'ilah applies to a burnt offering. Burnt offering is the greater sanctity, koche kochim, and it is burnt completely on the altar. Nobody eats the burnt offering. So it'll apply to it both of fowl and of an animal, the handful of meal and the frankincense from a meal offering, the meal offering of priests, the chavitin offering of the high priest. Did you know that the Kohen Gadol had to bring a meal offering every single morning? It's called chavitin. My daughter-in-law in Philadelphia is Israeli. Parents are American, but she grew up in Tel Aviv. And when she asks her kids if they want fried egg for breakfast, she asked them if they want a chavita. So this is chavitin, which is the plural of chavita. So it's a meal offering by the high priest. And the meal of the accompanying of from the time they were consecrated until they were taken out to the ash heap after being burnt on the altar. Okay. So those are of a greater sanctity. 4, similarly, the prohibition against meal applies to the bull and the goats that are burnt from the time they were consecrated until they're burnt, and their burning is complete in the ash heap, and their meat is burnt thoroughly in their entirety. Before it is burnt thoroughly, the prohibition against meal applies to it, even though it is in the ash heap. It's only when it becomes ashes that there's no longer any violation. Similarly, the prohibition against me'ila applies to the red heifer, okay? Take note, this is one of the quiz questions. I'm giving you a clue. Don't say I don't help you out, eh? Similarly, the prohibition against me'ila applies to the red heifer, the para aduma, from the time it was consecrated until it was reduced to ash, even though its status is that of an entity consecrated for the improvement of the temple. Concerning it, it says in Numbers, Pashas Chukas, it is called a korban chatas, a sin offering. And it is one of the conditions established by the court, by the rabbis, that a person does not violate the prohibition against me'ila with the ashes of the red heifer. Now, the ashes of the red heifer were unlike other animals. Other animals, we didn't do anything with the ashes. The red heifer, the whole purpose of shechting and burning the red heifer was to sprinkle the ashes on someone who was tomei, who had contracted tumah, spiritual defilement, by contact with a dead body, which is the highest, most potent force of tumah in Jewish law, and it required the para aduma. So they would take the ashes of the para aduma and mix it. In Parashas Chukas, in Numbers 19, it tells you what went into that potion, hyssop and other stuff, and they mixed it together and they sprinkled that on the person who was tummy. That was part of his purification process. So even though the ashes of the red heifer are used for a sacred purpose, the rabbis, the court ruled that you will not violate me'ila with the ashes of the red heifer. 6, prohibition against me'ila applies to all the following: sin offerings of animals, guilt offerings, korban chatas, korban osham, communal peace offerings, shlomim, shalmei tzibur, from the time they were consecrated until the blood is cast on the altar. Once the blood is cast, the prohibition against me'ila applies to their organs and fats until they're taken to the ash heap. It does not apply to the meats. Similarly, the prohibition applies to a sin offering of fowl from the time it's consecrated until the blood is presented on the altar. After the blood is presented, the provision does not apply. However, it's forbidden to benefit from its mura. What is mura? It's a Hebrew word in the Chumash. Who knows what mura is? Don't feel bad.
Something bitter.
Strength.
No, that's a good guess. That's a very educated guess, Dave. Well done.
Gavura.
Mura, you see it here? Here where I'm pointing, M-U-R-A-H.
Oh, more.
Mura. See? It means the crop of the bird. So it is forbidden to benefit from the mura and its feathers. If one benefits from them after the blood is presented, he does not violate the prohibition against me'ila. 7. By the way, you learned it yesterday if you were participating. What do you have to do if you're guilty of me'ila, of sacrilege? How do you atone? What's the consequence? Who remembers from yesterday?
There was so much yesterday that
You had to pay back,
Wasn't
pay
present.
back the money plus a fifth. Plus,
Very good, very good. You have to pay back what you used plus 20% fine.
yeah.
And you had to bring a korban me'ila, a special offering called a me'ila, a sacrilege offering.
A
Okay.
fifth,
That was just a bit of review.
extra fifth,
Sorry?
extra fifth, isn't it?
An extra fifth, yeah, 20% is a fifth.
Yeah.
Okay, prohibition against meal applies to meal offerings from the time they were consecrated, even though they have not become consecrated and placed in a sacred utensil. Okay, so they would put them in a sacred, one of the vessels of the temple, which was holy. Once it hits that, now it's consecrated. But not everything works that way. So he says, me'ila applies to meal offerings from the time they were consecrated, even though they have not become by being placed in a sacred utensil. And it goes until the handful of meal is offered on the altar's pyre. Pyre is the bonfire. Once the handful is offered, the remainder of the offering is permitted to be eaten. If the remainder of the offering becomes disqualified or lacking in substance, and then the handful is offered, now we have a question, and I don't think this question is resolved. Since offering the handful does not cause the remainder to be permitted to be eaten, such as there is an unresolved doubt. Yeah, if the meal offering is absolved from the prohibition against meal or not. That's if the remainder of the offering became disqualified and then the handful was offered, there's an unresolved doubt about what the din is there. 8, the prohibition against meal applies to the showbread. Okay, the lechem haponim that the Kohanim would eat on Fridays, they would take home for their families, the showbread. Miraculously, they remained fresh the whole week on the shulchan, on the special table, the golden table in the Kodesh, next to the menorah and the golden incense altar was the shulchan in the Kodesh, in the holy part of the temple, where only a Kohen could enter. So the prohibition applies to the showbread from the time it was consecrated, even if it was not baked yet, until the bowls of frankincense are offered on the altar's pyre. Now, later, they take it home to eat, so that it's there for the eating. But before it's meant to be eaten, then you could be guilty of sacrilege. Once the bowls of frankincense were offered, it is permitted to be eaten. Still, the prohibition against meal applies to the 2 loaves of Shavuot. They are called Shtei Halechem. The 2 loaves of Shavuot. On Pesach, we eat matzah. On Shavuos, we eat bread. And there were 2 special, like challah loaves, brought as a special offering on Shavuot. So it could apply there too if you use this for your personal. If you chapped some of it and you weren't meant to. From the time they were consecrated, even before they were baked, until the blood of the sheep is cast on the altar. I guess the lechem aponim was brought the same time as the sheep, for Yontif. After the blood of the sheep was cast, they are permitted to be eaten. 9, the prohibition against meal applies to the libations, the nesuchim. They would pour wine. The whole year they poured wine on the altar, it went down into a drain. And there was a time of year that they didn't pour wine, they poured water. Who knows what time of year that was?
Wasn't that during?
It was a yontif.
Yeah, Yom Kippur.
No. But you're very close. You're hot. What comes just after Yom Kippur?
Sukkot.
Sukkot.
Yes, Sukkot. Yeah.
On Sukkot, there was what they called Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Special joy of drawing the water that was poured on libations on Shavuot, on Sukkot. So, prohibition against me'ila applies to libation once they've been consecrated. That's wine the whole year. Once they are poured and descended to the shittin that's down below, the prohibition against me'ila no longer applies. Then on Sukkot, as we said, they poured water. As long as the water used as libations on Sukkot is in the golden jug, benefit should not be derived from it. But one who does is not liable. So you're not supposed to, but if you do, you don't have to go through the 20% and the offering. If it was placed in the pitcher, the prohibition against meal applies to it in its entirety, for it is one of the libations. So that's already sort of more consecrated. It's ready to be poured now. 10. Prohibition against meal applies to the log of oil. Log is a measurement. I'm not sure if it's a liter or something. Log of oil brought by a person afflicted by tzoras. Okay, if you had tzoras, the leprous curse, you had to be purified at the end of the week or whatever it was, however long it took. And one of the things he had to do was to bring a measurement of oil. So this will apply, so it's also sacred. And it'll apply from the time it was consecrated in the sacred vessel until the blood of the guilt offering was cast on the altar. Once the blood of the guilt offering of the Metzora was cast, one should not benefit from it until the placements are made from it. But the prohibition as Me'ilah no longer applies. Again, it's forbidden, but if you do it, you don't have to go through, bring the offering and all that. After the placements were made, it calls in Hebrew, it's called matanot, gifts. It is permitted for the Kohanim to partake of the remainder of the oil like the meat of sin offerings and guilt offerings. So the Kohanim were able to enjoy the meat of the sacrifices. Here they could use the oil too after a certain point in the service. 11, the provision of the does not apply to any of the blood of sacrificial animals that were slaughtered, whether before atonement is attained or after atonement is attained, until it flows out to the Kidron River. There was a whole system. It went downhill. There was a whole drainage system. Once it flows out to the Kidron River, then the prohibition against Me'ilah does apply to it because it was sold as fertilizer for gardens. They used the blood. Did you know that blood was a good fertilizer? And the proceeds of the sale are consecrated. If, however, one lets the blood, you know, in the olden days they used to let blood, even from humans as healing. They had bloodsuckers that were used by healers. So if you let the blood of an animal, a consecrated animal, it is forbidden to benefit from that blood, and you will be guilty of Me'ilah if you do. Since the animal cannot exist without blood, it is considered as its body. The Torah says, Ki hadam hu hanefesh, when it speaks about not consuming blood, that we should not consume blood, it says, Ki hadam hu hanefesh, because blood is the life of the person. It's like the soul. With regard to the bones, the giddim, I think giddim are sinews. The horns and the hoofs, which were separated from sacrificial animals of the highest degree of sanctity, the prohibition against Me'ilah applies when it was separated before the blood was cast on the altar, but not to those which were separated after the blood was cast. As far as the bones of a burnt offering that was separated before the blood was cast on the altar, once the blood is cast, the prohibition no longer applies. The casting of the blood causes them to be permitted. If they were separated after the blood was cast, the prohibition against Me'ilah applies to them forever. When the bones of a burnt offering fly off the altar, what do you mean it flies off the altar? Since when do bones fly? So, you know, some people fly off the handle, right? So what does it mean? Sometimes from the fire, you know, there's like combustion. It could be a little, like a mini explosion, and things could fly off the altar. So if the bones of a burnt offering fly off the altar before midnight, the prohibition against Me'ilah applies to those bones. After midnight, no longer. Even if it flew up before. The rationale being that since midnight arrived, all of the bones are considered as if they have been consumed by fire and as if they have been reduced to ash, even if physically they have not. So it's sort of a legality. 13, when a coal flies off the fire, now you might want to use that coal to cook a marshmallow or something. Whether before midnight or after midnight, it is forbidden to benefit from it, but the prohibition against Me'ilah does not apply. So you're not allowed to do it, but you won't have to bring the offering if you do. Prohibition against Me'ilah applies to a coal that was consecrated for the improvement of the temple. It is forbidden to benefit from a flame, but the prohibition against Me'ilah does not apply to it. So you should not roast your marshmallows on the temple altar flames. The prohibition against Me'ilah applies to the ashes of the outer altar. We spoke before about the ashes of the red heifer, that you could use them. Now he says there's a prohibition applying to the ashes of the outer altar. That's where the animals are burnt, both before the ashes were removed from the altar and after it was removed. Quite strict. However, with regard to the ashes of the inner altar, which is the inner altar? I mentioned it before.
That's in the
It's the golden
in,
altar.
in this in
Oh,
the
is it?
sanctuary.
In the sanctuary, the gold incense altar, where the Kohen would burn the incense daily. That was a small, delicate golden altar, whereas the big outer altar was a big copper and wood giant thing where they burnt multiple carcasses at the same time. The ashes of the inner golden incense altar and the ashes of the menorah, which was also inside the same area in the Kodesh, and the oil left ashes. There's wick and oil, and it left ashes, which the Kohen would clean every morning. It's called Trumat Hadeshen. So the ashes of the inner altar and the ashes of the menorah, we may not benefit from them in the first instance, but if you do, you will not have to bring a sacrifice or pay any penalties. Finally, number 16, whenever there is an animal that was consecrated for a sacrifice of the most sacred order, Kodesh Kadoshim, that contracted a disqualifying physical blemish, so it was already consecrated, but then it became disqualified because it became blemished. Whether they discovered the blemish afterwards, meaning it had a blemish originally, then they consecrated, then they discovered the blemish, or the blemish came after the consecration. It had an altercation or something and got blemished. Either way, the prohibition against meal applies until it is redeemed. So if there's a blemish, you may not use it on the altar. You have to redeem it. But until such time as you redeem it, then you can use it for personal use, you will be guilty of me'ilah sacrilege. It even applies if the animal is unable to be sacrificed because of a time factor. Maybe they missed the deadline. A different law applies with regard to turtle doves whose time to be offered has not arrived, and young doves whose time to be offered has passed, that were consecrated to be offered on the altar. Even though it is forbidden to benefit from them, one who does derive benefit has not violated the prohibition against me'ilah, so he won't have to bring a sacrifice or pay a fine. The rationale being that since they are not fit to be redeemed, they are comparable to sin offerings consigned to death, and so the prohibition against me'ilah does not apply to them. Question 1. If one improperly uses an animal that has a lesser sanctity, is he liable for me'ilah? This was the very first halacha 1. Can't hear you.
No,
No.
I wasn't here for that one, so I don't know.
Number 1. Thank you, Ken. The prohibition of me'ilah does not apply to sacrifice of lesser degree of sanctity until the blood has been cast. But once it has been cast, it would apply. So it depends when. Let's see. It's just a yes or no answer. Let's see what happens. Look it up. Ken is right. What do you mean look it up? It applies only to the fats and organs. Okay. Thank you, Ken. Question 2. When is one liable for me'ilah with the red heifer? You got 3 options.
I think it's the first one.
Yes, I agree. Well done.
Yeah.
When is one liable for the 2 breads of Shavuot?
Number 3.
Yes, agree.
Well done, Dave. Guys are actually listening. I'm impressed. When an animal contracted a blemish before it was consecrated, does me'ilah apply?
Not sure.
I would go for 2. Wrong. Oh,
No, number 3. Yeah, number 3.
okay.
Until it is redeemed.
That was the last halacha, actually, wasn't it?
I think so.
Until it is redeemed. There we go. Okay, guys, thank you very much.
Thank you,
I
Rabbi.
was, I was learning this together with you,
Thank you,
so
Rabbi. Shkar.
Safe
Okay.
travels,
And,
Rabbi.
Shavua tov.
have a good holiday, whether you're going or
Rabbi,
not. Yes,
Rabbi, thanks very much for your webinar with Dov Katz last night. It was very nice, very nice.
thank you for listening. I posted a link.
Come on, Rabbi.
Cheers, everyone. Safe travels, Rabbi.
Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi. Enjoy your break.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rabbi
But
Shkar. Good day.
Bye, bye.
I hope to still carry on this year. We'll see.
Yeah,
Rabbi,
why not?
again.